brothers to Warhammer. Tonight we're diving into shocking evidence showing that the Grey Knights could possibly activating the Terminus Decree soon. Before we get into madness, be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for support. I've been absolutely killing it like always. Now, let's get into the madness.
There are secrets in the Imperium of Man that are more terrible than a billion battlefield dead. There are truths more ruinous than the opening of a warp breach above a shrine world, more final than the silence that follows Exterminatus, more spiritually poisonous than the whispered names of the ruinous powers. The Imperium can endure horror. It was built upon horror. It can endure martyrdom, privation, mass graves, planetary immolation, whole sectors reduced to charred reliquaries and drifting cinders. It has endured all of these for 10,000 years and named that endurance virtue. But there are some truths that do not merely wound the body of the Imperium. They strike at its soul. The Terminus Decree may be one of them. It may be one of the darkest contingency orders ever concealed within the vast, diseased machinery of the Emperor's realm. Not because it promises destruction alone, but because it may describe a duty so hideous that only the purest and most merciless servants of the throne could ever be trusted to enact it. That is the question hanging over this subject, like incense smoke in a sepulchral chapel, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. Not whether the Grey Knights possess the decree, they do. Not whether it is real, it is. Not whether it was hidden for an age beyond memory, warded from all but the highest sanctums of Titan. The old law has long made that clear. The real question, and the one that should trouble any soul who understands what kind of age the Imperium has become, is whether the Grey Knights are drifting closer to the moment for which it was intended, whether they are approaching that final threshold of sanctioned despair, whether the galaxy itself is beginning to resemble the exact shape of the nightmare for which the decree was written. There is no certainty in that. There is no clean proof, no single line of text that allows a sane man to pound the lectern and declare that the end has been scheduled. But there is enough shadow gathering around the subject now to justify dread. More than dread, perhaps. Recognition. Because this is not merely another sealed casket in the Museum of Warhammer Mysteries. It is not one more intriguing relic to be filed away beside lost Primarchs, forbidden weapons, shattered prophecies, and all the other half-glimpsed fragments that make the setting feel ancient and wounded. The Terminus Decree sits at the convergence of names that matter too much to ignore. Titan, Malkador, the Golden Throne. Even before anyone begins speculating about what the decree says, those names alone transform it from curiosity into omen. Deep within the chambers of purity, within the Grey Knights' fortress monastery on Titan, in a chamber said to hold the tomb of Malkador the Sigillite, rests a plain wooden box sealed with gold. Within it lies the parchment of the Terminus Decree. Only a supreme Grand Master may open it, and only when all hope for humanity's future seems lost. The seal upon that box is whispered to match another found in only one place in all the Imperium, upon the Golden Throne itself. That is not decorative lore. That is a line of connection driven like a ritual blade through the heart of the setting. And once that connection is understood, the mood around the decree changes at once. It ceases to be merely mysterious and becomes sacramental in the darkest possible sense. The Grey Knights are not simple custodians of a forgotten text. They are keepers of a sanction bound by implication to the throne world, to the regent of Terra's deadliest predecessor, and to the carrion divinity enthroned in agony at the center of mankind's collapsing empire. One does not bind Titan, Malkador, and the Golden Throne together by accident. One does not hide such a thing in the sepulchral dark, beneath layers of purity rites and sigil wards, unless its contents are ruinous beyond ordinary comprehension. The old phrase attached to the decree has always mattered for that. Reason. It could bring the Imperium to its knees, or save it in its darkest hour. In Warhammer, that is never a comforting contrast. It is not the difference between doom and salvation. It is the difference between one damnation and another, one wound and a deeper one apocalyptic necessity and a greater blasphemy. That is why the real horror here is not what the Grey Knights might desire. Desire is almost irrelevant where they are concerned. They are not a chapter shaped by vanity, conquest, or political appetite. They are a blade forged for impossible duties, a brotherhood designed from inception to go where the Imperium cannot look and do what it cannot admit. If the Terminus Decree matters now, it matters not because the Grey Knights are eager to wield it, but because they may be the only beings in the Imperium capable of obeying it if the appointed hour comes. That is a far more chilling prospect. Enthusiasts imagine secret weapons. They imagine final victories. They imagine a box opening on Titan and some hidden power spilling out to scour the foes of mankind. But Warhammer's ugliest truths are seldom concealed at the center of grand battles or emblazoned across triumphal murals. They are hidden in relic chambers, in sealed orders, in side remarks and final sanctions, in those fragments of lore that seem almost incidental until one realizes they sit beneath everything like buried explosive charges. The Imperium is full of cathedrals, but its deepest truths are written in contingency plans. This is why the Terminus Decree should be approached with grave attention rather than with the empty excitement of revelation for its own sake. In a healthier universe, if such a thing could be imagined, a final decree kept in secret by holy warriors might imply deliverance. In Warhammer, it implies cost, it implies blood price, it implies that some future crisis was foreseen so clearly and judged so intolerable that an instrument of ultimate necessity had to be set aside for the final extremity. The decree does not promise rescue. It promises obligation. It promises that there may come a moment when the guardians of Titan must act in a manner so terrible that history itself would likely record them as traitors were the full truth ever known. That possibility is where the true dread lies, not in hidden power, but in hidden duty. Not in revelation, but in compulsion. The Grey Knights may not be waiting to unleash a miracle. They may be waiting to fulfill an order that no one else in the Imperium could endure even knowing about. And if that sounds too severe, too apocalyptic, then it is worth remembering what age this is. The galaxy is split by the Great Rift. The Emperor's realm persists in a state that can scarcely be called life, sustained by fanaticism, attrition, dogma, and mechanical habit, more than by coherent sovereignty. Terror remains the center of the Imperium, but it is also its oldest wound. The Golden Throne is not merely a symbol of continuity. It is a shrine built around perpetual failure, an engine of unending postponement, a throne of survival purchased by agonies beyond count. To invoke anything tied to that throne is already to step beyond ordinary military logic and into eschatology. This is why the Terminus Decree cannot be treated as a footnote. Any sanction linked by seal, secrecy, and custodianship to the Golden Throne is not a peripheral mystery. It is an inner chamber mystery. It is a heart of empire mystery. It is a question about the Emperor as much as it is a question about the Grey Knights, and therefore a question about terror itself, about the spiritual architecture of the Imperium, about the thing humanity has spent 10 millennia worshipping while pretending it was merely enduring. That is the central thesis here, and it is important to keep it disciplined. The evidence does not prove activation. It does not prove that some silent conclave on Titan has already broken the seals, or that silver-armored warriors are even now advancing through hidden sanctums towards some final chamber of command. To claim that would be to leap beyond the law into fever dream. But the evidence does suggest something else, and that something else may be almost as unsettling. It suggests that the Imperium has been drifting for a long time into exactly the kind of condition that would justify the existence of a decree like this. The galaxy has become more unstable, more spiritually inflamed, more apocalyptic in its pressures, and more willing than ever to pull old mysteries out of the dark and force them back into relevance. That matters. In Warhammer, once a relic ceases to be mere texture and starts attracting renewed narrative gravity, it is usually because the setting has begun circling the possibility that the relic may one day be used. So the path forward with this subject has to be careful. We begin with what is known: the old lore, the chamber on Titan, the tomb of Malkador, the golden seal, the golden throne, the limitation that only a supreme grandmaster can unmake the sanctified secrecy of the box when all hope appears spent. From there, the trail leads into newer implications, into the changing condition of the Imperium, into the ways recent developments make older mysteries feel less ornamental and more active. And beyond that lies the truly disturbing ground, the place where one must ask not only what the decree is, but what kind of reality would force the Grey Knights to acknowledge it as more than a relic. That is where the horror sharpens. Because once the subject is no longer treated as an atmospheric oddity, and instead as a live possibility within the metaphysics of the setting, every old clue begins to darken. The worst part is that the Grey Knights are precisely the wrong people to dismiss. Had this secret belonged to fools, fanatics, vainglorious warlords, or the squabbling carrion elites of terror, it would almost be easier to ignore. But the Grey Knights are dreadful because they are disciplined. Their sanctity is sharpened into utility. Their faith does not resemble the fevered chanting of the mob or the political pieties of priests swollen on incense and authority. Their devotion is a weaponized purity, cold and narrow, and capable of stepping over the corpses of whole worlds if that is what the eradication of a greater evil demands. If such beings are entrusted with a final sanction linked to the throne, then the authors of that sanction did not expect it to be interpreted sentimentally. They expected it to be obeyed. That should terrify everyone. Not because the Grey Knights are unstable, but because they are stable enough to do what others would call unthinkable. And so the shadow hanging over the Terminus Decree is not the shadow of some triumphant last stand. It is not the gleam of a hidden superweapon waiting to redeem the age. It is the shadow of recognition. Recognition that the Imperium's deepest safeguards may be indistinguishable from sacrilege. Recognition that the holiest warriors of mankind may carry, in secrecy and silence, an order bound to the most sacred and most terrible object in human history. Recognition that the true endgame of the setting may not be a glorious return, but a sanctioned refusal of one. The decree should terrify because it suggests that in the Imperium's darkest hour, salvation itself may become suspect. And if that is true, then the Grey Knights may not be preparing to save the Imperium in the way most souls imagine. They may be preparing to deny it the miracle it believes it has been awaiting for 10,000 years. Before any soul begins weaving theories around the Terminus Decree, before the fevered imagination of the fandom turns it into a hidden superweapon, a resurrection rite, a final exorcism, or some apocalyptic switch concealed beneath the throne of mankind, the first duty is to state plainly what the law actually gives us. In a setting swollen with prophecy, contradiction, and cathedral-sized rumor, clarity is itself a kind of discipline. The Terminus Decree is not described as a war engine. It is not presented first as an artifact of destruction. It is described as an ancient instruction, a scripture or command set down upon old parchment, sealed away in secrecy by the Grey Knights. That matters. The language around it has always pointed not to brute force, but to decree, sanction, order, and burden. Even in its oldest form, it does not sound like a weapon waiting to be fired. It sounds like a commandment waiting to be obeyed. And the object itself, for all the dread wrapped around it, is almost offensively humble. Not a stasis reliquary crusted in psycho-reactive gemstones. Not a vault of black iron chained with hexagrammic wards the size of tank treads. Not a labyrinthine machine whose workings scream of forbidden science. A simple box, a plain container, a relic so unadorned that its simplicity becomes part of the unease. Warhammer has always understood the power of that contrast. The galaxy's ugliest truths are rarely wrapped in the forms one expects. A thing does not become less terrible because it is quiet. Indeed, in the Imperium, the quiet things are often the worst. The Terminus Decree rests not as an object of spectacle, but as an object of restraint, hidden rather than displayed, unrecorded rather than catalogued, known not to the priesthood of 1,000 worlds, but to a vanishingly narrow line of custodians on Titan. The artifact goes unrecorded in the libraries of the Imperium and remains concealed from all but the highest sanctums of the chapter. That location is the next fact, and it is impossible to overstate its significance. The decree is hidden on Titan, within the Chamber of Purity, deep in the fortress monastery of the Grey Knights. More than that, it is said to rest in the chamber that holds the tomb of Malcador, the Sigillite. That detail alone should banish forever the notion that this is some stray fragment of chapter folklore. Nothing in the architecture of Grey Knight's lore is casual when it touches Malcador. He is not merely another dead imperial worthy interred in honorific silence. He is the Emperor's regent, the first lord of terrible necessities, the master of seals and hidden instruments, the patron saint of sanctioned dread. To place the Terminus Decree beside his tomb is to place it within the bloodline of last resorts. It is to say, without saying so directly, that this parchment belongs to the deepest reserve logic of the Imperium, to the hidden calculus of extinction and survival that men like Malcador existed to bear. Titan is already a moon of secrets. The Chamber of Purity is already a sanctum of absolution and finality. But when Malcador's tomb is named in the same breath, the entire thing changes color. The mystery ceases to be merely martial and becomes imperial in the oldest and blackest sense of the word. Then there is the matter of access, and access in the Imperium is always theology disguised as protocol. The law is brutally narrow here. Only the Grey Knight's Supreme Grand Master knows how to open the box. Not the Brotherhood at large, not the chapter's officers in broad consultation, not the Inquisition, not Terror, not some conclave of allied powers. A single office, a single bearer of sanctioned authority. That restriction tells us much more than a dozen pages of speculation ever could. The Imperium does not narrow knowledge like that, unless the knowledge is judged spiritually ruinous, politically catastrophic, or metaphysically dangerous. The fact that the method of opening is itself secret suggests that the decree is not merely hidden by walls, but by right. It is warded by obedience. The Supreme Grand Master is not simply the only one permitted to read it. He is the only one entrusted to cross the threshold at all. That is not archival caution. That is the architecture of ultimate sanctions. The condition for opening it is harsher still, and this is where the decree's reputation truly earns its shadow. The parchment is to be revealed only in humanity's darkest hour, only when all hope for the race is lost, only when the future itself appears spent. This is not the language of contingency in the ordinary military sense. It is the language of terminal crisis, not battlefield desperation, species desperation, civilizational ruin. The phrase has always carried an eschatological weight because it places the decree beyond campaign planning, beyond sector defense, beyond the common brutalities of the age. The Imperium can lose worlds without blinking. It can lose armies, crusades, saints, even primarchs. It has weathered all of these and called the blood toll acceptable. But the Terminus Decree belongs to the category of threats for which even the Imperium has no natural tolerance. It is meant for the hour in which ordinary atrocity has failed and all lesser remedies have already been exhausted. That alone should tell us that whatever lies on that parchment was not written for victory in the conventional sense. It was written for the edge beyond which the species does not meaningfully continue. And then we arrive at the old wording that has haunted the decree from the beginning, the line that has given it so much of its mythic poison. Once opened and spoken by the Supreme Grandmaster, it may either save mankind from certain defeat or doom it to oblivion for all eternity. That is one of the purest Warhammer phrases ever attached to an unseen object, because it strips away the illusion that salvation in this universe is clean. The Terminus Decree was never framed as a benevolent answer tucked away for more optimistic ages. From its earliest presentation, it was bound to dual catastrophe. It could preserve, it could annihilate, it could redeem the race from one end only by exposing it to another. There is no generosity in such language, no mercy. Only the ruthless admission that in the last extremity of things, mankind's final options may be indistinguishable from damnation to all but the most pitiless eye. That is why the decree has always felt older than mere mystery. It feels like a relic from the part of the Imperium that no longer believes in pure rescue. Yet for all that dread, for all that secrecy, for all the implications of extinction and salvation balanced upon a single hidden command, there has always been only one concrete clue to the decree's deeper nature. One clue, and one alone, repeated across the lore with a precision that makes it impossible to dismiss as atmospheric decoration. The golden seal upon the box. That seal is the anchor point, the one physical detail that turns the whole matter from broad unease into focused terror. In a setting full of symbols, seals, sigils, purity marks, honor badges, oath scrolls, chapter crests, litanies, and relic iconography enough to bury a planet, a single seal would ordinarily mean little. But this one is different because the lore isolates it. It tells us that the only real clue to the contents lies there, not in the wood, not in script on the lid, not in whispered testimony from those who have stood nearby, in the seal, in that one sign impressed upon the box like a final confession that someone, somewhere, wanted the worthy to understand at least this much. And the seal matters because of where its twin is said to be found. Not in some archive beneath the Himalayan plate, not in a sigil vault on Luna, not on a forgotten relic blade from the days of Unity. The whisper is far more severe than that. The seal is said to match another found only in one place in all the Imperium, upon the Golden Throne itself, within the Imperial Palace on Terra. That is the detail around which every serious reading of the Terminus Decree must revolve. Not because it gives us the answer, but because it tells us the level at which the answer exists. If the seal truly corresponds to the throne, then the decree is not merely a Grey Knight's matter. It is not even merely a Titan matter. It is bound, by sign and implication, to the central wound of the Imperium, to the Emperor, to the throne, to the impossible machine upon which the species hangs, suspended between extinction and continuation. No secret tied by symbol to the Golden Throne can ever be considered minor. Such a connection elevates the decree at once into the innermost circle of imperial horror. And this is the moment where one must resist the temptation to rush onward into theory, because the connection itself deserves to be contemplated in silence for a moment. The Golden Throne is not merely a seat, nor merely a relic engine, nor merely the life support apparatus of a dying god. It is the axis around which the Imperium has broken itself for 10,000 years. It is cult and machine, prison and altar, beacon and wound. Everything in the Imperium either points toward it, depends upon it, lies about it, or dies for it. For the Terminus Decree to bear a seal linked to that singular object means that whatever is enclosed within the box cannot be understood as a local chapter concern, however elite that chapter may be. It implies authorship or sanction from the highest and most secretive echelon of the old Imperium. It implies an intended relationship between Titan's hidden brotherhood and Terra's central agony. It implies that the Grey Knights do not merely defend mankind from demons in the abstract, but stand in some concealed relation to the Emperor's condition and the continuity of the throne itself. Even before newer sources sharpened that possibility, the old law was already shouting it in the only way it knew how, through symbols, placement, and ritual limitation. So when people speak of the Terminus Decree as though it were a pleasingly obscure Grey Knight's curiosity, they diminish what was present from the beginning. The core facts were always too pointed for that. Ancient parchment, a simple hidden box, Titan, the Chamber of Purity, the Tomb of Malkador, a supreme Grand Master alone entrusted to open it, an hour when all hope for humanity is lost, the promise that its utterance could either preserve mankind or cast it into everlasting oblivion, and above all, the golden seal that leads not outward into the galaxy's clutter, but inward, back to the throne. These are not the attributes of a side mystery. These are the attributes of an inner court mystery, a final sanction embedded close to the spiritual and political heart of the Imperium. That is the proper way to understand the Terminus Decree before anything else is added. Even before later hints, later codices, later contradictions, later theories about rebirth or denial, it was never random. It was never some atmospheric oddity stuffed into Grey Knight's lore to make Titan feel older and stranger. From the moment the details were laid down, the decree was already a throne-level mystery. It belonged to the same family of dread as the Emperor's silence, Malkador's final labors, and the machinery of terminal necessity that keeps the Imperium stumbling onward through its long damnation. The decree is not terrifying because we do not know what it says. It is terrifying because, even in ignorance, we can already see where it points. The obvious question stands there at once, stern and inescapable, like a warding statue before a sanctum door. If there truly exists a final sanction bound to Titan, Malkador, and the Golden Throne, then why would such a burden fall to the Grey Knights at all? Why not the Adeptus Custodes, whose entire existence is bound to the person of the Emperor and the defense of Terra? Why not the High Lords of Terra, those bloated keepers of imperial continuity, those lords of parchment, tithes, fleets, and decrees? Why not some hidden priesthood of the palace, some mechanism within the secret state of the throne world itself? On the surface, all of those might seem more obvious custodians for a decree linked to humanity's ultimate crisis. The custodes stand nearest to the master of mankind. The High Lords govern in his shadow. Terra itself is the center of all imperial legitimacy. And yet the sanction was not laid in their hands. It was hidden instead on Titan, under the guardianship of the Grey Knights, and that choice tells us a great deal before a single further mystery is solved. The question is not why the Grey Knights seem unusual custodians. The question is, what kind of order would require exactly the sort of beings they were made to be? To understand that, one must strip away the popular image of the Grey Knights as merely elite demon hunters in silver plate, and remember what they actually are in the bones of the law. They are not simply another chapter with a specialization. They are not an honored blade within the military order of the Imperium in the ordinary sense. They are a hidden foundation laid in the last and blackest days of the Horus heresy, when the Emperor foresaw that the war against chaos would outlive the siege, outlive the legions, and perhaps outlive his own active hand upon the species. Malkador gathered chosen agents and warriors in secret, drew together the framework that would become both the Inquisition and the Grey Knights, and brought the founding brethren to Titan beneath the veil of his own esoteric labor. Titan itself was hidden away by his rites, preserved beyond Horus's reach, while the old Imperium bled itself to death. Janus was appointed the first Supreme Grand Master. The chapter that emerged was secret, deliberate, and born already tied to Malkador's concealed architecture of necessity. This was never a force intended for parade or reassurance. It was a hidden blade forged for the wars the Imperium could not publicly admit it was fighting. That origin matters more than almost anything else when asking why the Terminus Decree came to them. The Grey Knights are children of the Imperium's final pragmatism, of the moment when idealism had already burned away and only grim design remained. The Custodes are magnificent, but their purpose is direct and visible. They are the Emperor's companions, the wardens of his palace, the guardians of his physical and symbolic precinct. The High Lords are powerful, but their power is political, ceremonial, and unstable, forever rotted by faction, ambition, and the needs of governance. The Grey Knights are something else entirely. They were conceived for the hidden war for the soul of mankind. The official histories barely contain them. Their archives are sealed, their battles are excised, their triumphs are built upon exterminations, mind wipes, and the purging of witnesses. They were made not to comfort the Imperium, but to preserve it by means the Imperium could never endure looking at too closely. Such a force is the natural vessel for a sanction tied not to public command, but to ultimate spiritual crisis. And that phrase matters more than it might first appear to. Spiritual crisis. The Terminus Decree is not framed in the old law as a response to a mere military emergency. It is to be opened when all hope for humanity is lost, and that moves it beyond the realm of strategy into the realm of eschatology. This is not a matter of reinforcing a crusade front or salvaging a collapsing subsector. It concerns the fate of the species, the condition of terror, the machinery of the Golden Throne, and whatever final relationship exists between the Emperor's state and mankind's continued survival. That is why the Grey Knights fit this burden in a way the Custodes do not. The Custodes defend the Emperor's person and his realm. The Grey Knights were made to confront the warp corruption that seeks to devour human destiny itself. They are anti-chaos, not simply in the tactical sense of killing demons, but in the metaphysical sense of standing against the ultimate spiritual defeat of the species. If there exists a decree intended for mankind's darkest hour, then a brotherhood bred, trained, and sanctified for precisely that sort of final confrontation becomes grimly logical as its custodian. Titan's secrecy reinforces that logic. Malcador did not merely found the Grey Knights. He concealed them, equipped them, prepared their fortress monastery in advance, appointed their first supreme Grand Master, and tied their identity to sigils and rites that carried his own mark into the future. Even their iconography bears his shadow. The sigil of Malcador is bound into their tradition and flesh. Much of their history was removed from common record, their existence known only where necessity allowed. This is not decorative secrecy, it is functional concealment. Institutions like the Administratum, the Ecclesiarchy, and even much of the broader Inquisition thrive upon layers of sanctioned ignorance, but the Grey Knights were built to inhabit a deeper chamber of that ignorance than most. They are custodians not merely of dangerous weapons, but of dangerous truths, truths other imperial bodies were never meant to possess, because possession itself would deform them. A High Lord must govern appearances as much as realities. A custodian must defend what is before him. A Grey Knight is trained to walk into unreality, to know it, to resist it, and to act without hesitation once the truth is stripped bare. That difference is everything. This is why the Grey Knights do not exist to preserve comforting illusions. In truth, almost no serious imperial institution does, but some are at least forced to traffic in them. The Ecclesiarchy must preserve faith. The High Lords must preserve the appearance of continuity. The Astra Militarum must preserve morale. Entire planets are allowed to live and die inside lies, because lies are useful to empire. The Grey Knights stand outside that economy of consolation. Their history proves as much. When demonic contamination spreads, they do not flinch from extermination. When witnesses survive things the Imperium deems spiritually intolerable, the Grey Knights have shown a ruthless willingness to purge allied soldiers and civilians alike in order to contain corruption and preserve a greater secrecy. They are not monsters in the cartoon sense. They are more terrible than that. They are instruments of necessity, built to enact solutions that decent men would call unforgivable and that weak men would fail to carry out. If the Terminus Decree requires obedience to something that would appear abhorrent, blasphemous, or treasonous to almost every other arm of the Imperium, then the Grey Knights are not a strange choice. They are the only sane one. There is a bitter irony there that Warhammer handles better than almost any setting when it is at its strongest. The Grey Knights are famed in the lore as uniquely incorruptible among the Adeptus Astartes. Not a single one is recorded as having defected to chaos across 10,000 years of service. Their purity is not casual rhetoric, but one of the defining pillars of their myth, and yet the same purity may be exactly why they are suited to a duty that would look, from almost any external vantage, like sacrilege. That is the true sting. A corrupt or power-hungry force could never be trusted with a decree tied to the Golden Throne, because every action they took would be suspect. But a brotherhood renowned for incorruptibility, ritual purity, psychic discipline, and unwavering mission focus can be entrusted precisely because they are more likely than anyone else to carry out a horror for the right reason. In the Imperium, trust is never sentimental. It is never based on warmth, affection, or noble fellowship. It is functional and brutal. You trust a thing to do the job it was made to do, and the Grey Knights were made to look into the abyss without blinking. Seen in that light, the question shifts from why. They were chosen to why anyone else ever seemed plausible. If Malcador wished to place a final sanction beyond the reach of politics, vanity, public religion, and bureaucratic decay, then Titan was the proper vault. If the Emperor wished such a sanction to endure into an age of ignorance and institutional degeneration, then it needed custodians whose culture was built around secrecy, obedience, and resistance to corruption. If the order was of the kind that would one day require immediate acceptance rather than public debate, then it needed to rest in the hands of warriors trained not merely to understand necessity, but to enact it in impossible conditions. The Grey Knights are logical, not because they are beloved, but because they are usable in the precise way such a decree would require. They are the chapter one would choose if hesitation itself would be fatal. One can almost feel Malcador's thinking in that structure. Not trust as a moral compliment, but trust as a grim calculation. Who can know this? Who can bear it? Who can obey it? The answer was never likely to be Terra's Senate of Carrion Lords. It was always going to be the hidden sons of Titan. And that is where the demon-hunting identity of the Grey Knights begins to look, not false exactly, but incomplete. Of course it is real. They are the chamber militant of the Ordo Malleus. Their wars against the warp are legendary, even when those legends are expunged. But the deeper one studies the architecture around them, the more that role starts to resemble the visible layer of a larger purpose. They are humanity's anti-demon force, yes, but perhaps also the keepers of a more dreadful reserve function, one tied not to the battlefield manifestations of chaos alone, but to the final integrity of the Emperor's design. The Terminus Decree sits in that implication, like a toxin in the bloodstream. Why entrust a demon-hunting chapter with a parchment hidden near Malcador's tomb and linked by seal to the Golden Throne, unless their responsibility reaches further inward than most assume? Why make the Supreme Grand Master the only soul allowed to unveil it, unless the knowledge concerns something so central that even the Imperium's own institutions must be denied it? The answer may be that demon slaying is only the outer labor, the visible office of a brotherhood whose innermost purpose concerns a catastrophe far closer to Terra's heart. So the reason the Grey Knights were chosen is not obscure at all, once one abandons the hope that the Imperium distributes burdens according to honor or prestige. It distributes them according to utility, secrecy, and the capacity to endure moral injury without collapse. The Grey Knights are Malcador's hidden blade, carried into the afterlife of the heresy. They are the instrument forged to face truths no wider institution could be allowed to metabolize. They are pure enough to be trusted, ruthless enough to obey, hidden enough to be preserved, and spiritually armed enough to confront the warp taint woven through mankind's endgame. If a decree existed that one day might demand an act outwardly indistinguishable from blasphemy in order to avert a greater ruin, then there was never a more logical vessel. And if that is true, then the most unsettling possibility is also the simplest one. The Grey Knight's highest duty may never have been merely the destruction of demons. It may have been the prevention of a final catastrophic state centered upon the Emperor himself, a doom so terrible that only the most incorruptible warriors in the Imperium could be trusted to stand before it and do what had to be done. Long before the newer material began to cast a harsher light upon the Terminus Decree, before later Codex-era whispers seemed to drag the old secret closer to the center of the setting's living dread, the decree existed in a different register. It was one of those old Warhammer mysteries that seemed almost more powerful for being half seen, not absent, not forgotten, simply left in that sacred murk where the setting often stores its most potent horrors. The core facts were there from the beginning: a simple box on Titan, an ancient parchment within, the Chamber of Purity, Malcador's tomb, a supreme Grand Master alone permitted to open it when all hope for mankind appears lost, a seal linked in whispered implication to the Golden Throne. Those details were enough to make the imagination itch, but not enough to settle anything. So the void around the decree filled itself, as voids in this universe always do, with rumor, inference, dread, and the kind of speculation that thrives precisely because no possible answer feels safe. That older age of speculation is worth lingering in because it reveals something important about how Warhammer mystery functions when it is at its strongest. The Terminus Decree was never interesting because there were endless possible benign answers waiting to be discovered. It was interesting because from the first moment serious readers looked at it, the plausible answers were all terrible in different ways. Some imagined that the decree concealed a hidden superweapon of truly terminal scale, not simply another relic blade or psychic device, but a last resort force held back for the extinction hour. Others believed it might be a warp purge of apocalyptic magnitude, some final cleansing sanction that would scour the Immaterium's corruption from the species, or drive the dark gods and their legions from humanity's fate. Others still treated it as a final exorcism of civilization itself, a rite of dreadful purification reserved for the hour when every ordinary means of resistance had failed. And hanging over all of it was the oldest and most intoxicating possibility of all, that the decree might amount to some final command laid down by the Emperor, a sealed instruction not to win a war in the ordinary sense, but to determine what was to become of mankind when the age at last reached its breaking point. Those were rumors, not confirmed answers, but they were not foolish rumors. They arose naturally from the nature of the object itself, and from the kind of narrative gravity that clings to anything tied by symbol to the Golden Throne. Among those rumors, one theory endured with a special force because it aligned so perfectly with Warhammer's old habits of tragic possibility. It held that the Terminus Decree might halt the workings of the Golden Throne itself, bringing to an end the ancient machinery that preserves the Emperor's mortal shell, and in doing so, releasing him for rebirth. This was not a comforting theory, though many spoke of it as though it were. Even in its most hopeful form, it implied catastrophe. The throne is not simply a seat of state or a holy engine of life support. It is bound to the survival of terror, to the prisoning of old disaster beneath the palace, to all the vast, strained mechanisms by which the Imperium postpones an abyss it no longer fully understands. To speak of halting it was to speak of gambling everything on the possibility that the Emperor might return in a form capable of saving what his continued enthronement merely preserves. That is not a dream of rescue. It is a theory of sanctified risk on a species-wide scale. Yet it persisted because it had a bleak kind of beauty to it. The Imperium, after 10,000 years of decline, would finally be forced to decide whether its god must die in order to live. But the opposite possibility was always there as well, like a colder blade held behind the first. What if the decree existed for the exact inverse purpose? What if it was not the means by which the Emperor might be released from the throne, but the means by which he might be denied release forever? What if the parchment on Titan did not contain a liberation rite at all, but a prohibition? An order that under no circumstances could the master of mankind be allowed to leave that machine, whether by rebirth, resurrection, ascension, or any other form of impossible return. Seen in that light, the Grey Knights cease to look like custodians of a last hope and begin to look like enforcers of an eternal imprisonment. The old mystery allowed for that reading too, even before later material sharpened it, because the decree was always described in terms that balanced salvation against oblivion. It was always a sanction that could preserve or doom. It was never framed as pure deliverance. That made the darker interpretation not only possible, but deeply appropriate to the setting's moral logic. And that is perhaps the most Warhammer thing about the entire affair. Both of those broad theories are horrifying, and they are horrifying in completely different ways. If the decree meant shutting down the throne to permit rebirth, then the horror lay in the risk that Terra itself might be consumed, that the Emperor's return might come too late, come wrong, or come as something no longer fit to save mankind. If the decree meant preventing the Emperor from ever leaving the throne, then the horror lay in the opposite revelation, that the Imperium's most sacred aspiration had always been forbidden, that its final guardians might one day be required to maintain a state of endless divine torment rather than end it. One theory turns salvation into a gamble with annihilation. The other turns loyalty into the maintenance of cosmic suffering. In a lesser setting, one of these would be the noble interpretation, and the other, the dark twist. In Warhammer, both are dark. Both are plausible. Both feel like exactly the sort of thing the setting would dare to mean. The mystery endured for so long because the one physical clue kept dragging every serious reading back to the same place. The seal. Always the seal. Not a passage of legible text. Not a surviving witness statement. Not a codified explanation in some adjacent sourcebook. A seal, impressed upon a humble box, and the whisper that its twin or match existed only upon the Golden Throne itself. That single detail was enough to arrest every flight of speculation and pull it inward again toward terror. That is why the more extravagant theories never fully drifted into nonsense. The seal would not allow it. No matter how far the imagination ranged, it was always forced to return to the same inescapable truth. The Terminus Decree was linked, by sign if not by plain exposition, to the central wound of the Imperium. Not to a frontier crusade, not to a demon world, not to some forgotten vault in the halo stars, to the throne, to the Emperor, to Terra. That anchor made every rumor heavier. It made every possibility more intimate. It told anyone paying attention that the decree was not about a distant emergency. It was about the heart of empire. This is why old Warhammer mysteries often work best when the possibilities are all catastrophic. The setting is at its richest. Not when there is a puzzle with one satisfying heroic answer waiting beneath it, but when every answer reveals a different shape of damnation. The Terminus Decree became compelling because it never invited optimism without punishing it. A hidden force to save mankind might also be the force that brings the Imperium to its knees. A right to restore the Emperor might also release the final destruction of Terra. An order to preserve the throne might also condemn the species to worshipful stagnation forever. In that sense, The uncertainty was not a flaw in the decree's old presentation. It was part of the terror. Not knowing did not weaken the idea. Not knowing allowed the idea to infest the imagination more deeply, because every plausible interpretation exposed some new abyss beneath the imperial faith. The decree remained hidden and therefore alive, unopened and therefore spiritually active. Even before the newer material entered the picture, there was already something profoundly disturbing in the simple fact that the Grey Knights possessed such a sanction at all. No chapter should hold authority over anything touching the Golden Throne in this way. No brotherhood of Astartes, however pure, however secret, however sanctified by Malcador's legacy, should appear to stand in custodianship over a mystery that gestures toward the Emperor's condition and the terminal options of the Imperium. Yet that is exactly what the old law implied. The Grey Knights did not merely carry weapons against the demon. They guarded a final order of such consequence that it could concern the preservation or ending of mankind's central sacred mechanism. That alone elevated the decree far above ordinary relic law. It suggested that Titan's hidden sons were entrusted not just with destroying warp manifestations, but with some reserve authority over a crisis no chapter ought ever be allowed to govern. That implication was terrifying precisely because it felt improper, and yet entirely in keeping with Malcador's old brutal logic. So the uncertainty became part of the object's function. The decree frightened because it was undefined. It sat in the law like a sealed reliquary at the back of a crypt, something whose shape could be described, but whose contents could only be guessed at through the spiritual damage it seemed poised to inflict. Fans argued over whether it meant rebirth, prohibition, weapon, exorcism, or annihilating sanction, but those arguments all revolved around the same shared intuition. Whatever the truth was, it would not be clean. It would not be comforting. It would not reward the human desire for a final answer that restores moral order. In that sense, the decree represented the best kind of old 40,000 mystery. It did not merely conceal information. It generated dread through structure alone. Everything about its placement, restrictions, and associations announced that the answer would hurt. And now that older age of rumor looks different in hindsight. The true shock is not that people speculated wildly. They were always going to. The law was built to provoke exactly that. The real shock is that the newer material may have narrowed the field, and may have narrowed it in the darkest direction available. Once the possibility enters that the decree is not some path to release, but an order of denial, not a final miracle, but a final refusal, all those old rumors do not disappear. They curdle. The old mystery does not become less frightening because one interpretation gains weight. It becomes more frightening because the broad haze of catastrophic possibilities begins to condense around one especially pitiless center. That is what makes the modern discussion of the Terminus Decree so potent. Not that it has ceased to be mysterious, but that the mystery may no longer be pointing everywhere at once. It may be pointing, with increasing severity, toward a single truth the Imperium was always too afraid to speak aloud. There is a difference between an old secret and a living alarm. For years, the Terminus Decree existed in the law as a sealed dread, a relic of ultimate sanction that hung over Titan like a funeral bell no one had yet struck. It was terrible, yes, but terrible in the old way, in the half-mythic way, as though it belonged to some final horizon forever receding before the Imperium's endless habit of survival. Then Cadia broke. The sky itself was split. The great rift tore reality from pole to pole, and what had once seemed like apocalyptic metaphor became strategic fact. The galaxy did not merely worsen, it changed state. Warp storms multiplied, demonic manifestations surged, the old boundaries between materium and immaterium thinned, and the Imperium was forced to look upon a wound so vast that even its accustomed language of doom felt insufficient. In that new age, the Terminus Decree stopped feeling abstract. It stopped being only an old chamber secret and started to look like the kind of measure that might one day be weighed in earnest. Lexicanum's summary of the law states that due to the formation of the Great Rift, Kaldor Drago and the other Grey Knights Grand Masters were supposedly considering reading the Terminus Decree. That single shift, from relic to consideration, is the first real alarm bell. The wording matters. It matters with almost liturgical severity. Not opened, not enacted, not proclaimed aloud in the sepulchral dark of Titan's innermost sanctum. Considered. That is the hinge upon which this entire chapter turns. There is a profound difference between the existence of a final sanction and the moment the highest guardians of that sanction begin to weigh whether the age has grown dark enough to justify even contemplating it. In military terms, a weapon sealed in a vault is one thing. A command staff gathering around the possibility of unlocking it is another. The Terminus Decree had always been described as the Grey Knights' ultimate sanction, to be used only when all hope for mankind is lost. Once the chapter's highest command begins even to discuss whether the age approaches that threshold, the atmosphere around the decree is transformed forever. It is no longer only inherited dread, it becomes live contingency. And what kind of age forced that transformation? Not a crusade setback, not the loss of some valuable world, however holy, not the rise of a single black crusade, terrible though those have always been. The Great Rift was precisely the kind of civilizational wound for which a relic like the Terminus Decree seems to have been conceived. This is the point that must be felt in the marrow. The Rift was not merely another disaster among the Imperium's thousands. It was a tearing open of the cosmic conditions under which the Imperium had limped onward for 10,000 years. The Astronomican's reach was disrupted. Real space itself became unreliable. Entire regions were cast into nightmare. Isolation. Demonic outbreaks surged across the breadth of human dominion. Even terror was assailed in the Battle of Lion's Gate, and the Grey Knights were driven to the forefront of an age defined by incursions, psychic instability, and the collapse of old assumptions. In the age of the Dark Imperium, the Grey Knights found themselves overwhelmed by fresh warp storms, demonic wars, losses among their Grand Masters, and a strategic burden vast enough to strain even Titan's hidden brotherhood. An old last resort begins to look less ornamental under such a sky. This is where Kaldor Drago becomes more than a famous name and starts to matter as a sign of metaphysical change. Drago has long existed in a state already half legendary, a supreme Grand Master cast adrift in the warp, a silver revenant fighting impossible wars in the madness beyond real space. He was always a figure bound to the instability between worlds, but after the formation of the Great Rift, the lore notes a change. Drago discovered that he could return to the material realm for greater periods of time. The Grey Knights' prognosticars believed his presence had become linked to Mortarion through ties of hatred, while the Rift itself had frayed the old barriers between warp and fleshly existence. He later appeared to the Grand Masters and asked for their counsel, and because of the dire state of the Imperium, the Terminus Decree was given consideration. That sequence is haunting for reasons deeper than simple plot movement. Drago's altered relation to real space is itself evidence that older boundaries are fraying. He is no longer merely the lost champion making impossible apparitions. He becomes a symptom of a wider unraveling, a warrior whose changed ability to manifest reflects the same diseased permeability now afflicting the galaxy at large. The tone around the decree changes forever at precisely that point. Once the Terminus Decree ceased to be only a relic in a box and became a subject of discussion among the chapter's highest command, the entire question was elevated from ancient mystery to active strategic horizon. One can feel the shift in gravity at once. Before, the decree existed primarily as lore depth, as ominous architecture, as the kind of hidden sanction that enriches the setting by implying older and darker layers beneath the visible wars. After the Great Rift, it becomes something else, not a certainty, not an imminent countdown, but a live option resting, however heavily, somewhere within the Grey Knight's conceptual armory. That is a terrible distinction. Once a last resort has entered discussion, it is no longer protected by pure abstraction. It has crossed a threshold into relevance. Even if it is never used, even if its seals remain untouched for another 1,000 years, the knowledge that Titan's lords have already looked toward it once cannot be forgotten. This is why this moment functions as the first real evidence chapter in the larger argument, not evidence of activation. That claim would go too far and would weaken the gravity of what we actually have. Evidence, rather, that the setting itself has already moved the Terminus Decree from static atmosphere toward practical significance. There is a world of difference between saying the Grey Knights possess a horrifying final order and saying that after the Great Rift, their supreme Grand Master and Grand Masters considered whether the age might warrant reading it. The former is background. The latter is escalation. The former is law. The latter is law becoming pressure. This is the kind of subtle but decisive movement Warhammer often uses when it wants to drag some old hidden thing from archival gloom into the edges of the current age. It does not always begin with revelation. Sometimes it begins with consideration, a mention, a counsel sought, a decision not yet taken, but no longer unthinkable. At the same time, discipline is required here. Consideration does not equal imminent activation. The Great Rift made many impossible things thinkable without making them inevitable. The Grey Knights are burdened by duties so extreme that one should expect them to weigh even the darkest contingencies when the Imperium totters. To acknowledge that they considered the decree is not to claim that they stand ready this very hour to invoke it. It means only what it means, and what it means is already severe enough. The threshold between myth and contingency has been crossed once. That is the real significance. A final sanction reserved for humanity's darkest hour has already entered the consciousness of those tasked with guarding it during the most catastrophic upheaval of the modern setting. To overstate that into certainty would be crude. To understate it into irrelevance would be blindness. It is also worth dwelling on the kind of men who are having this discussion. These are not the fevered priests of the ecclesiarchy or the senescent masters of Terra's administrative carrion empire. These are the Grand Masters of Titan, the stewards of the Grey Knight's deepest secrets, men conditioned for psychic war, ritual purity, and the bearing of burdens other imperial institutions were never meant to touch. If such beings, under the pressure of the Great Rift, began to weigh the Terminus Decree, then they did so from within a framework of necessity rather than hysteria. That does not make the possibility safer. It makes it colder, more exact, more worthy of fear. A frightened mob imagining the end of all things is ordinary in the Imperium. The inner lords of Titan quietly asking whether an ultimate sanction should be read is something else. It suggests not panic, but the recognition that the galaxy had entered conditions close enough to the decree's intended purpose that even disciplined minds could not ignore the correspondence. And that is why the post-Cadia age must be treated as the first true alarm bell in this story. The Great Rift did not prove what the Terminus Decree contains. It did not tell us whether the final duty of the Grey Knights concerns rebirth, refusal, preservation, or something even darker. But it did something perhaps more important for the modern reading of the mystery. It demonstrated that the decree belongs not only to ancient speculation, but to the active moral and strategic perimeter of the current setting. It proved that the old box on Titan is not buried so deeply in the mythology of the chapter that it can never again cast a shadow upon present events. Under enough pressure, under a wound large enough, under a crisis that rends reality itself, the decree rises from the depths of law and enters council. That changes everything about how it must now be read. From this point onward, every fresh escalation in the setting has to be measured against one grim fact. The Grey Knights have already looked in that direction once. The chamber on Titan is no longer sealed away in purely imaginative distance. The Great Rift dragged it closer. Drago's altered relation to the material realm dragged it closer. The Imperium's widening spiritual collapse dragged it closer. That does not mean the final threshold has been reached. It does mean the path toward it is now visible in a way it was not before. And once a path like that becomes visible in Warhammer, once an old sanction begins to acquire the shape of live possibility, the wise reaction is not excitement, it is dread, because the first real alarm bell is never the last. There comes a moment in the life of an old mystery when the darkness around it changes. For years the Terminus Decree was dreadful because it was undefined, because it sat in the innermost gloom of Grey Knight's lore like a sepulchral reliquary no living hand had yet dared unseal. It was a box on Titan. It was Malcador's shadow. It was the golden throne implied by sign and silence. It was the kind of secret that made the imagination feverish, precisely because no answer had been fixed upon it. Then the newer Codex era reporting arrived, and with it came the possibility that the old question had at last received its most harrowing answer yet. Not a superweapon, not a purgation engine, not a final miracle. Something colder than all of those, something more intimate, something so pitiless that it alters the moral geometry of the Grey Knights the instant it is taken seriously. The reported revelation is simple in wording and monstrous in consequence. According to the recent reporting on the new Grey Knights Codex, the Emperor is never to be permitted to leave the Golden Throne at all. Not if he returns to life. Not if he is reborn in another vessel. Not if he rises into some higher psychic or warp state that would appear to the wider Imperium as the long-awaited transfiguration of its carrion god. The command is not framed as caution in the abstract. It is an instruction of refusal. Should such a thing occur, the Grey Knights are to intervene and compel his restoration to the throne, to return him to what the reporting itself describes as his terrible duty, regardless of what powers, armies, saints, or impossible forces stand against them. That is not merely dark law, that is an edict of cosmic incarceration. One has to sit with the obscenity of that for a moment, because Warhammer works best when a revelation is allowed to wound before it is interpreted. The Emperor is the axis of the Imperium's faith, the fixed corpse at the center of 10,000 years of prayer, sacrifice, conquest, delusion, and desperate continuity. The notion that the ultimate hidden command of the Grey Knights may be to deny his release is hideous enough. The notion that they may be required to force him back into enthronement if some form of return occurs is worse. That is not loyalty in any comforting sense. It is not reverence as the masses of terror would understand it. It is not deliverance. It is the maintenance of agony as statecraft.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
It is the preservation of a divine wound, because the wound itself has become the one mechanism keeping reality from failing outright. Once that possibility enters the blood of the law, the whole atmosphere around the Terminus Decree changes from mystery to sentence, and it changes the Grey Knights with it. Before this revelation gained traction, one could still indulge the fantasy that Titan's final sanction might make the chapter liberators in the last extremity. One could imagine them as the custodians of some forbidden path by which the old prison of the throne might finally be broken and the master of mankind unleashed into history again. But if this newer answer is even broadly correct, that image dies at once. The Grey Knights cease to be the possible agents of release and become instead the appointed enforcers of endless torment. Their role is no longer to open the gate for a god's return, but to seal it shut, even if that god himself should rise and stride toward the threshold. The implications are almost too severe to bear. The most incorruptible of the Emperor's Astartes may exist, at the very highest level of hidden duty, not to free him from suffering, but to perpetuate it. Seen in that light, the old clue of the golden seal upon the box becomes almost unbearable in retrospect. For years it merely tethered speculation to terror. It told us, in the old cryptic way of this setting, that the Terminus Decree was never a local curiosity of Titan, but something bound to the innermost sanctity and horror of the throne world. The seal matching one found only upon the golden throne made the connection obvious long before the contents were ever suggested in plain terms. But now the sign means more. It no longer looks like a hint toward hidden power waiting to be unleashed. It looks like a mark of jurisdiction, a sign that the command within the box was always meant to speak directly to the condition of the throne and the fate of the being bound within it. The old mystery did not merely point toward terror, it pointed toward custody over terror's central suffering. That is a much blacker thing. It also recontextualizes the secrecy. Why hide the decree so deeply? Why place it in the chamber said to hold Malcador's tomb? Why lock it behind rites known only to the Supreme Grand Master? Why reserve it for the hour when all hope for mankind appears lost? Those details once sounded like the normal architecture of an ultimate weapon or a final reserve sanction. Under this newer reading, they become grimly exact. Such a command could not be entrusted to any broader body, not to the High Lords, not to the ecclesiarchy, not even to the ordinary structures of the Inquisition, because almost every institution in the Imperium would either reject it in horror or attempt to exploit it for power. To know that the Emperor must never leave the throne is to know that the Imperium's holiest dream may be forbidden by the very design of its deepest guardians. That is the kind of truth civilizations fracture around. Malcador would understand that. Titan would be built for that. The Supreme Grand Master alone would be burdened with that, because only a burden carried by one soul can sometimes survive an empire built on pious lies. This is also the point at which the Terminus Decree stops resembling a weapon mystery and becomes something far more dreadful, an existential command structure. A weapon kills an enemy. A command structure defines reality by dictating what must happen when all alternatives have become impossible. Under the newer interpretation, the decree is not telling the Grey Knights what to fire, what to unleash, or what ancient device to activate. It is telling them what the Imperium itself must not be allowed to become, even if that forbidden transformation arrives wearing the face of miracle. It is a prohibition against a certain end state. It is a doctrinal kill switch aimed not at a foe, beyond the walls, but at a metaphysical crisis centered on the Emperor, terror, and the fragile continuance of human existence. That is why the revelation feels so different from the older rumors. It is not bigger in the crude sense. It is narrower, sharper, more intimate, and therefore much worse. The necessity implied by that command becomes clearer, not kinder, when set against what the Golden Throne actually does. It is not merely a life support machine for a dying sovereign. It is bound to the Emperor's old webway project, to the sealing of catastrophic breaches, to the prevention of demonic inundation upon Terra, and to the continued functioning of the Astronomicon through the Emperor's surviving will. Secondary law reporting argues that if the Emperor simply departs the throne, Terra does not receive a clean resurrection narrative. It receives invasion, psychic catastrophe, and the opening of realities too terrible for the wider Imperium to endure. Add to that the older, heresy-era revelation of the Dark King possibility, the idea that the Emperor's ascent into a higher warp state may not be salvation at all, but a civilization-ending transformation, and the shape of the decree becomes more comprehensible in the most horrifying way. The order begins to look less like cruelty for its own sake, and more like the final brutal refusal of a worse apocalypse. Even so, caution remains necessary. The exact presentation of this revelation varies in the ecosystem of secondary sources, and Lexicanum explicitly flags conflicting source issues around aspects of the Terminus Decree's history and discussion. That matters, and it should be said plainly. This is not the place to pretend that every line is settled with doctrinal perfection, but the direction of implication is now unmistakably darker and much more specific than it used to be. The old field of catastrophic possibilities has narrowed. The modern reading no longer sprawls across endless theories about hidden purges and vague ultimate forces. It converges, with frightening precision, upon the Emperor, the throne, and the Grey Knights, as the chosen jailers of a truth the Imperium itself could never survive hearing in full. And that is why this revelation changes everything. Once this possibility is on the table, once it becomes thinkable that the Terminus Decree is an order to prevent the Emperor's release, and if need be, to force his return to the throne, then the whole question of timing acquires a new gravity. The old phrase that the Grey Knights may trigger the Terminus Decree soon no longer sounds like melodrama. It no longer feels like the empty inflation of a title written to provoke a gasp. It begins instead to sound like a real metaplot question, the kind one is almost afraid to ask aloud, because the answer would expose what the Imperium has truly been guarding all this time. The Grey Knights may not be the wardens of mankind's final miracle. They may be the last brotherhood tasked with preventing it. There is a childlike temptation that clings to this subject, a reflex so simple that it almost feels obscene in a universe like this one. The Emperor rises, the corpse god stands, the throne is abandoned. The master of mankind returns to the age that has rotted in his absence, and by his return, all debts are called in, all enemies broken, all nightmares banished into ash. It is the kind of thought a healthier mythology might permit. In another setting, perhaps, the king returns and the realm is healed. But Warhammer has never been built upon that kind of mercy, and the Golden Throne has never been a mere waiting chair for a sleeping sovereign. It is not enough to say that the Emperor leaving the throne would change the Imperium. The truer and darker thing is this. The Emperor leaving the throne might shatter the conditions that allow the Imperium to exist at all. That is the first layer of the problem, and it is so vast that many discussions never move beyond it. The Golden Throne is bound to the catastrophe born from the Emperor's failed webway project. When Magnus broke through the wards of the Imperial dungeon, the bridge into the webway was catastrophically breached, and demonic hosts flooded toward Terra in endless fury. The Emperor took the throne not as an act of passive survival, but as an act of active containment, using his psychic will to stabilize the failing passage and prevent the demonic tide from overrunning the palace, and through it, the cradle world of mankind. The war in the webway devoured the strength of custodes and sisters of silence alike, and even after the great retreat from that secret war, the throne remained what it had become in that hour of failure, a lock upon disaster, a psychic bastion rammed against a door that can never be allowed to swing wide. So when people speak glibly of the Emperor simply rising, as though he were a wounded monarch expected one day to throw off the blanket and step back into his court, they are not merely simplifying the law, they are misunderstanding the shape of the danger. The throne does not only preserve the Emperor's broken body, it suppresses a ruin beneath Terra that has never truly gone away. The demons that broke into the webway were not defeated in some clean and final sense. They were held back, contained, denied full ingress by a burden that only the Emperor's might could sustain. Secondary reporting on the new Terminus Decree ties this plainly to the current age. If the Emperor leaves the throne, Terra faces demonic catastrophe and the opening of a warp rift born from the old damaged webway connection. That is not a political crisis. That is not a succession crisis. That is a heart of empire extinction event. And already, one can feel the shape of the Grey Knight's hidden duty beginning to change in the mind. If the Emperor must remain enthroned, because his absence would unleash the old disaster beneath the palace, then the Terminus Decree stops looking like a command against hope and begins, in one savage sense, to look like a command against immediate annihilation. It is still monstrous. It is still cruel. It still reeks of sacrilege to any soul raised upon the common faith of the Imperium. But the logic becomes visible. The Order is not necessarily anti-Emperor. It may be anti-apocalypse. It may exist because what the wider Imperium would celebrate as resurrection could, in practical terms, be the signal for Terra's destruction and the drowning of human dominion in demonic night. Yet even that is only the first layer, and perhaps not the worst one. Because let us imagine, for a moment, that some impossible means were found to avert the immediate disaster beneath the throne. Let us imagine that the webway breach could be contained by some other sacrifice, some other mechanism, some other impossible convergence of relic, psyche, and providence. Even then, the Emperor's rising would not become a simple tale of salvation. The second layer of the problem is more metaphysical, more poisonous, and in some ways more perfectly Warhammer than the first. Apotheosis in this universe is not clean. Transcendence is not automatically benevolent. The warp does not hand out crowns without twisting the brow that wears them, and the law has already shown us a name for the possibility that should make every sane servant of the throne recoil: the Dark King. The Dark King is not idle fan chatter. Lexicanum summarizes it as a theoretical fifth chaos god prophesied by both humanity and the Eldari, and in the final stages of the Siege of Terra, it became apparent that this being was destined to be the Emperor himself. That fact should hit like a shell burst in the center of every simplistic resurrection theory. The Emperor's ascent is not guaranteed to culminate in a radiant father returned to reclaim his species with gentle omnipotence. One possible trajectory of his unleashed divinity is the birth of something catastrophic, a force of merciless judgment and cruel rationality, not a maker, but an unmaker. Even the language attached to the Dark King is all wrong for comfort. It does not smell of healing. It smells of terminal transformation, of divinity curdled into a new and terrible cosmic principle. This is where the whole matter becomes properly dreadful. The Emperor's continued enthronement may preserve a wound. His release may create a god. And in Warhammer, the creation of a god is very rarely good news for mortals. We are not speaking here of a shining ascension that gathers the faithful beneath a kinder heaven. We are speaking of a universe in which psychic concentration, mass belief, atrocity, and metaphysical instability can birth realities that feed on souls and history alike. The possibility that the Emperor might rise as some greater warp entity does not solve the problem of mankind's spiritual dependence. It may intensify it beyond all measure. Under that light, the new reporting on the Terminus Decree becomes even more severe. The command to prevent the Emperor from leaving the throne, whether returned, reborn, or ascended as a warp entity, begins to read less like blasphemy and more like a final quarantine measure against a species-ending metamorphosis. And the timing of all this matters. The current age is already saturated with signs that the spiritual condition of the Imperium is becoming more unstable, not less. Since the birth of the Great Rift, the galaxy has entered what the setting itself names the Psychic Awakening, a surge in psychic activity marked by intensified visions, unstable gifts, and a broader bleed of etheric force into reality. Warhammer community's own psychic awakening fiction speaks of strange events and dangerous tidings appearing across the Imperium, even upon shrine worlds. The age is thick with miracles, saints, prophetic anomalies, and a general sense that the old barriers between mundane and numinous experience are wearing dangerously thin. In such a climate, the thought of the Emperor simply rising cannot be detached from the wider fever gripping the species. A resurrection in an age of spiritual overpressure is not born into a calm galaxy. It is born into a powder magazine of faith, psychic instability, and apocalyptic expectation. That is why this chapter matters. This is the point where one must stop thinking of the Terminus Decree as an insult to hope and start entertaining the more harrowing possibility that it is a barricade erected against a chain reaction, not anti-emperor, anti-apocalypse. The cruelest order may also be the necessary one. The Grey Knights may be charged not with denying their gene sire or their sovereign out of faithlessness, but with preventing the exact kind of metaphysical cascade that would turn terror into a maw of demons and the Emperor into something vast, unstable, and terminally destructive, in a different universe that would be a twist too bitter to believe. In Warhammer, it feels almost inevitable. The setting has always reserved its deepest contempt for the idea that salvation should come without a second blade hidden behind it. And that, more than anything, is why the whole question fits so perfectly into the moral architecture of the 41st millennium. This is a civilization that feeds thousands of psychers into holy machinery each day, that turns genocide into bureaucracy, that mistakes postponement for victory and suffering for legitimacy. Of course, its deepest hidden command would not be a key to paradise. Of course, it would be a sanction forcing the purest warriors in the Imperium to maintain an abomination, because every alternative is somehow worse. Of course, the most sacred miracle of all, the Emperor's return, would carry within it the possibility of terror's damnation or the birth of a monstrous new god. That is the only kind of truth this setting ever truly trusts. Not clean redemption, managed horror, not final healing, controlled ruin. So when one asks now why the Grey Knights might one day be forced to act, the answer is no longer reducible to fear of change or blind obedience to some ancient parchment. It may be that they stand as the final ward against the one event the Imperium has spent 10,000 years praying for without understanding its cost. If the throne is a seal upon demonic catastrophe, and if the Emperor's unleashed divinity risks a second and even blacker disaster, then the Terminus Decree becomes horribly lucid. It is not a denial of victory. It is a recognition that there may be no victorious outcome left, only levels of extinction to be chosen between by those cruel enough to choose. Which leaves a final question hanging over Titan, like the tolling of a funerary bell. Were the Grey Knights created only to destroy the demons clawing at the walls of mankind's realm? Or were they created also for the more dreadful duty of stopping a chaos-scale catastrophe at the very heart of the Imperium itself? By this stage, the shape of the thing should be visible, not fully known, not cleanly resolved, not stripped of its old venomous uncertainty, but visible enough that the old comfort of abstraction can no longer be maintained. The Terminus Decree is no longer merely one of those antique horrors buried in the substructure of the setting, one more shrine sealed behind incense and sigil wards for atmosphere alone. The evidence chain has grown too deliberate for that. Any single fragment, taken by itself, can still be dismissed by the timid as flavor text, as rumor, as the usual cryptic excess by which the Imperium adorns its own nightmares. But when the fragments are placed beside one another, when Titan, the Great Rift, the failing throne, the Codex-era revelation, and the increasingly mobile metaplot are made to stand in the same chamber, the air changes. What once felt like old myth begins to feel like preparation. The first warning sign was the Great Rift. That remains the true hinge, the first moment when the decree ceased to be only a sepulchral relic and entered the language of live strategic concern. Lexicanum records that after the formation of the Great Rift, Kaldor Drago and the other Grey Knights Grand Masters were supposedly considering reading the Terminus Decree, and Drago's own entry repeats that in the age of the Dark Imperium, after his altered return to the material realm, he sought the counsel of the Grand Masters, and the decree was given consideration. That wording is not theatrical noise. It is a change in state. A secret may sleep for millennia in the architecture of the law, but once the highest command of Titan begins to weigh whether that secret belongs to the present emergency, the decree is no longer just a relic. It has become a strategic horizon. That distinction must be held with iron discipline, because it is easy for lesser minds to leap from dread into melodrama. Consideration is not activation. Consideration is not enactment. Consideration is not the opening of the box in the chamber of purity, while the wards scream and the last sanctified candles gutter beneath Malcador's tomb. But neither is it trivial. It is the kind of movement Warhammer uses when it wishes to drag some old hidden object from decorative antiquity into active relevance. The Grey Knights did not merely inherit the decree. Under the pressure of a galaxy split open by the warp, they looked toward it. Once that has happened even once, the tone around it can never return to what it was before. The second sign is harsher because it is more specific. The more recent Codex-era reporting did not merely mention the Terminus Decree in passing. It claimed to reveal its essential burden, that the Emperor can never be allowed to leave the Golden Throne, whether returned to life, reborn in another body, or ascended as some kind of warp entity, and that if such a thing were to occur, the Grey Knights must return him to his terrible duty, no matter what stands against them. Even allowing for the caution one should always maintain around secondary reporting, the implication is unmistakable. The decree is not being revisited in vague terms. It is being revisited in a way that points directly at the Emperor, terror, and the ultimate continuity of the throne. That is not the behavior of a setting merely dusting off an old relic for atmosphere. That is foregrounding. And once those two signs stand together, the pressure multiplier hanging over all of it becomes impossible to ignore. The Golden Throne is not stable. Lexicanum's Golden Throne entry notes that by late in the 36th millennium, it required more and more psychers to remain functional, that by early in the 41st millennium, 4 times the amount of psychers were required to maintain optimal power, and that in the last year of that millennium, tech priests discovered failures in its mechanisms that lay beyond their ability to repair. The broader time of ending chronology places those irreparable failures amid the growing dimness of the Astronomicon and the cascade of terminal crises closing around the Imperium in the final days before Cadia's fall. This matters because a decree tied to the throne becomes much more than a sealed theological horror when the machine to which it is bound is itself failing under the weight of ages. The old sanction does not exist in a vacuum. It hangs over a device already under sentence. That is where the chapter's cumulative logic truly begins to bite. The Great Rift pushed the decree from archive to discussion. The Codex-era reporting pushed it from broad mystery toward concrete function. The failing throne pushes that function into a living field of pressure. None of these by itself is enough to prove imminent invocation. Together, they are enough to show that the conditions around the decree are no longer static. They are tightening. This is how doom often works in Warhammer, not as a single trumpet blast, but as the convergence of long, separate omens that suddenly begin to harmonize into one intolerable note. It helps, too, to understand how much the broader shape of the setting has changed. For long ages, Warhammer 40,000 cultivated the illusion of vast stillness, a galaxy frozen in ritual decay, where everything changed only locally and nothing central was ever truly permitted to move. That has not entirely vanished, but it is no longer the whole truth. Warhammer Community's own retrospective on the editions says that the 9th edition brought the setting into the era Indomitus after the opening of the Great Rift, with Guilliman launching the greatest campaign the Imperium had undertaken in 10,000 years to reunite what had been sundered. The same official site later described the Arcs of Omen series as the most important narrative leap since the Gathering Storm and a grand new future. For Warhammer 40,000, that is not the language of a static backdrop. That is the language of a metaplot being advanced in heavy, deliberate steps. And if the metaplot is moving, then old sealed mysteries must be read differently. In a static age, the Terminus Decree could remain forever a delicious abyss, never clarified, never tested, forever doing the work of implication without consequence. In a moving age, when Games Workshop is willing to resurrect Primarchs, rupture the galaxy, escalate the psychic temperature of the setting, and label certain campaign series as epical narrative leaps. A revisited relic cannot be shrugged off so easily. The Wargamer report on the new codex makes precisely this inference, noting that the metaplot develops slowly and that when Games Workshop resolves a mystery, it is usually for a reason, even when the revelation appears only in a sidebar. One need not accept every flourish of that article to grasp the larger point. The decree being revisited at all suggests that it is no longer merely decorative lore. That is why phrases such as triggering soon must be handled with precision rather than panic. Soon does not necessarily mean tomorrow. It does not require the crude image of silver-armored giants already descending through hidden corridors beneath Titan with storm bolters maglocked and blades drawn for the throne world. In a setting like this, soon can mean something slower and more insidious. It can mean narrative rails being laid. It can mean old sanctions being moved from atmospheric obscurity into doctrinal relevance. It can mean the writers are preparing the audience to understand what a final order is for before ever depicting its invocation. In that sense, soon may describe proximity of design rather than proximity of date. The decree may be approaching use, not because the seal will break tomorrow, but because the galaxy is being made to resemble the purpose for which that seal was made. This is where one must distinguish clearly between activation, preparation, and doctrinal readiness. Activation would be the reading and enactment of the decree itself, the final threshold crossed. Preparation is something lower and more subtle, the quiet drawing together of knowledge, the weighing of omens, the recognition among Titan's highest keepers that the possibility belongs to the present age. Doctrinal readiness is lower still and perhaps more dreadful because it can exist for years unseen. The old command clarified, restored to interpretive force, placed once more into the consciousness of the setting so that when the hour comes, it does not feel arbitrary. By that measure, the evidence does not prove activation. It does suggest that preparation has happened at least once, and that doctrinal readiness is being deepened now by the way the decree has been reframed. All of this should make the culmination plain. The real shock is not that the Grey Knights possess a final order. They were always the kind of brotherhood who would possess such a thing. The real shock is the convergence, the great rift, Drago's altered relation to real space, the decree discussed by Grand Masters, the throne's mounting failure, the official metaplot's slow acceleration from the gathering storm into the era Indomitus and beyond, the Codex era narrowing of the decree's purpose toward the Emperor's continued enthronement. These are not proof of immediate execution. They are something, in a way, more unnerving. They are the signs of a galaxy beginning to assume the outline of the scenario for which the Terminus Decree was written. And once that outline becomes visible, dread stops being a pose and becomes the only sane response. Up to this point, the argument has moved deeper and deeper into dread, and because of that, it now requires a counterweight. Otherwise, the whole matter becomes too easy, too smooth, too much like a straight descent into revelation. But the Imperium is never that simple. Even if one grants the black possibility that the Terminus Decree is real in the harshest sense, that it concerns the Emperor's continued enthronement, and that the Grey Knights may one day be forced to act, a question rises at once like a wall of adamantine before the mind. What would stop them? What would stand in the path between Titan's hidden sanction and its execution? The answer is severe, and it is one of the main reasons this possibility remains so terrifyingly unstable. The Grey Knights may possess the duty, but almost every other pillar of imperial power would see the carrying out of that duty as madness, betrayal, or blasphemy on a scale beyond language. The darker the decree becomes, the more obvious it is that the greatest resistance to it may not come from the warp at all, but from terror. The first and most obvious obstacle is the Adeptus Custodes. One scarcely needs to embellish the point. The custodians are the guardians of the imperial palace, and the golden throne, the personal bodyguard of the emperor, and the imperial palace itself is explicitly overseen by them. That is not ceremonial wording. It is the core of their purpose. To imagine any force, even one as sanctified and incorruptible as the Grey Knights, advancing toward the throne in order to impose some hidden sanction, is to imagine a moment that the custodes would read first and foremost as a violation of their oldest and holiest charge. One may infer all sorts of nuances from that, but the foundation is plain enough. The custodes do not guard a policy. They guard the emperor. They do not keep watch over a metaphor. They keep watch over the throne, the palace, and the sanctity of Terra's innermost heart. A Grey Knight's force acting under the Terminus Decree would not be meeting passive observers in those halls. It would be colliding with the one brotherhood in the Imperium whose entire identity is built around never surrendering that ground. And this matters not only because the custodes are formidable beyond reason, but because their resistance would carry unimpeachable symbolic force. If the Golden Guardians of the Throne reject an action, then to the wider Imperium, that rejection would function as proof enough that the action is profane. It would not matter that the Grey Knights might possess a deeper sanction. It would not matter that Titan's hidden command could, in theory, descend from a level of necessity older than most of Terra's institutions. The sight, or even the rumor, of silver-clad Astartes pressing against the sanctum of the Emperor while the custodes stood in refusal would be enough to ignite the language of treason across 1,000,000 worlds. That is how deeply the symbolic order of the Imperium is anchored in visible guardianship. The custodes are not merely one military arm among many. They are the Emperor's living perimeter. To go through them, or around them, would be to make an enemy of the Imperium's purest public. Claim to sacred legitimacy. Then there is the ecclesiarchy, and with the ministorum the problem becomes even less tactical and more civilizational. The ecclesiarchy is the hierarchy of the imperial cult. It maintains and spreads the imperial creed, and the imperial cult is described as the Imperium's state religion, in many ways the religion and the state being bound together as one. This is not merely one powerful faction among others. It is the devotional nervous system of human civilization under the throne, the institution that teaches billions upon billions what the Emperor is, what his suffering means, what terror signifies, what obedience looks like, and what heresy must be called. A hidden Grey Knight's decree that required action against the enthroned God Emperor, even action intended to preserve the Imperium from a worse catastrophe, would strike the ecclesiarchy as the most impossible blasphemy imaginable. It would not be debated coolly. It would be denounced as a satanic inversion of the faith on which the Imperium rests. Priests would preach resistance. Pilgrims would riot. Shrine worlds would convulse. The language of holy war would not need to be invented for such a crisis. The Ministorum has spent 10,000 years rehearsing it. The political machinery above and around that faith would shatter just as violently. The Senatorum Imperialis, the High Lords of Terra, rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name. Even before one begins naming individual offices and vested interests, the meaning is obvious. A secret action undertaken at the level of the throne itself, especially one unknown to the governing body of the Imperium, would be received not as disciplined emergency stewardship, but as a coup against reality. The Inquisition complicates matters further rather than simplifying them. It is charged with guarding the souls of humanity and identifying threats to the Imperium, and its power is so sweeping that it answers only to the Emperor. In theory, that might suggest potential sympathy with some ultimate hidden necessity. In practice, it implies fracture. Some among the Inquisition would seek to validate the Grey Knights. Others would denounce them. Others would suspect a deception of chaos so profound that only annihilation could answer it. An act under the Terminus Decree would not create consensus among imperial institutions. It would detonate them from within. This is why even a correct execution of the decree could appear as treachery on a civilizational scale. That phrase is not exaggeration. It is simply the proper measure of the thing. Imagine the visible form of it. A hidden chapter of secret demon hunters, long shrouded from most imperial knowledge, moving under concealed authority toward the most sacred locus in human existence. The custodes resisting, the priesthood screaming sacrilege, the high lords tearing themselves apart between denial, panic, and opportunism. Inquisitors drawing blades against one another over whether Titan's sanction is holy necessity or ultimate heresy. Nothing about such an event would look righteous to the outer Imperium. It would look exactly like the sort of unthinkable profanation that every sermon warns against. That is the torment at the center of the decree's logic. If it is real in the darker sense, then its rightful execution may be outwardly indistinguishable from the very betrayal it exists to prevent. The Grey Knight's secrecy both helps and damns them here. It protects them because it preserves the decree from the contamination of ordinary politics, devotional hysteria, and institutional decay. Much of the Grey Knight's history remains shrouded in mystery and secrecy, or has been purposefully removed from archives, and even official Warhammer material still frames them as selfless secret warriors, waging a hidden war against demons and the eternal damnation of humanity. That secrecy is what allows them to bear truths others cannot. But the same secrecy isolates them. It means that when they emerge to act at the highest level, they do so with very little reservoir of public legitimacy. They are feared, half-known, sometimes barely known at all. Their authority is deep rather than broad. It is vertical, not social. They can carry a hidden truth, but they cannot easily explain it to the organs of empire without destroying the very architecture that allowed it to survive. That is part of why the decree had to be hidden from almost everyone, not merely to protect it from enemies, but to protect the Imperium from the knowledge that such a command might exist. A sanction of this kind could never live comfortably in the open bloodstream of imperial power. The ecclesiarchy would either corrupt it into dogma or denounce it as heresy. The High Lords would attempt to bury it, weaponize it, or make factional use of it. The Inquisition would split into Puritan and radical interpretations until half of Terra was at war in the shadows. Even the custodes, for all their magnificence, might treat it as intolerable intrusion upon their own first duty. So the decree's hiddenness is not a decorative flourish. It is functional design. It survives because almost no one is permitted to know it exists. It remains operative because it is withheld from the very bodies whose public authority would make it impossible to carry out, which leads to the bleakest possibility of all. Perhaps the Terminus Decree was never intended for consensus. Perhaps it was written precisely for the hour in which consensus no longer matters, when the machinery of imperial deliberation has become useless, when the priesthood, the Senate, the secret police, and even the guardians of the palace are all trapped inside the same expanding catastrophe. In that kind of hour, one does not convene for doctrinal harmony. One obeys the last viable command, or the species dies. If Malcador or the Emperor designed the decree in that spirit, then it's hidden. Structure makes grim sense. It is not waiting for approval from the Imperium. It is waiting for the moment when approval is impossible and only execution remains. That is why the obstacles surrounding it are so enormous. They are not flaws in the theory. They are part of the horror of it. The decree may be meant to function only when every institution that would oppose it has already become irrelevant before the scale of the crisis. And so the Grey Knight's greatest enemy in such a scenario may not be chaos at all. It may be the Imperium's own immune response. The custodes would defend the throne. The ecclesiarchy would defend the cult built upon the throne. The High Lords would defend the political order derived from the throne. The Inquisition would defend its own understanding of the Emperor's will and the species' survival. Every one of these institutions would believe itself loyal. Every one of them would see resistance as duty. That is what makes the whole prospect so exquisitely Warhammer. The chapter most loyal to humanity's long survival could find itself forced into conflict with the very defenders of humanity's shrine world, not because either side has ceased to serve the Emperor, but because the Imperium has become so spiritually diseased that its deepest loyalties can no longer coexist in daylight. And if that day ever comes, the darkest battlefield in the galaxy may not be some demon world at the rim. It may be the sacred heart of Terra itself, where the sons of Titan are driven to war against the guardians of the thing they are all trying, in their own incompatible ways, to save. When men speak of the Terminus Decree being triggered, they often imagine the crudest and most theatrical version of the thing. They picture silver giants marching in open defiance through the sanctified arteries of the Imperial Palace, nemesis blades drawn, storm bolters mag-locked, their tread ringing upon black stone as custodians turn in wrath, and the whole of Terra seems to hold its breath before the first impossible blow. It is a strong image, and precisely because it is strong, it is probably the wrong place to begin. The Imperium does not reach its deepest crises by leaping at once into spectacle. It reaches them by chambers within chambers, by whispers in vaults, by sealed rites and consultations held far beneath the notice of ordinary power. The Terminus Decree itself is framed in the old law not as a battle order, but as an ultimate sanction, something opened only in humanity's darkest hour when all hope appears lost. That alone suggests that its triggering may begin not with public action, but with a secret recognition among those few on Titan, burdened with even the right to think upon it. If that moment ever comes, it will likely begin where all true Grey Knight's responses begin, in inward council. The command echelon of the chapter is not a loose warrior aristocracy, but a tightly bound hierarchy, a council of the Chapter's 8 Grand Masters serving beneath the Supreme Grand Master, each charged with a distinct sphere of the chapter's hidden life. The lore already tells us that after the Great Rift, Kaldor Drago and the other Grand Masters considered the Terminus Decree, and that Drago himself appeared to the Grand Masters after discovering he could return to the material realm for longer spans, while the prognosticars interpreted the altered conditions around him. That is the first clue to what a future triggering would really resemble. Not a sudden charge, a council, a grim exchange of judgment, the Supreme Grand Master weighing a command too terrible to name aloud before all but the narrowest circle. The Grand Masters considering whether the omens have at last aligned with the sanction's purpose. The prognosticars, those readers of psychic tremor and warp-born pattern, casting their minds into the storm to measure whether the age has crossed from peril into terminality. That is, the kind of beginning which suits Titan. Not noise, but pressure. Not declaration, but readiness. The Grey Knights are already a brotherhood who move according to hidden geometries, deploying by foresight and teleport assault under the guidance of prognosticars who read the irrational tides of the warp. If the Terminus Decree began to stir in earnest within their councils, one might expect Titan itself to enter a higher state of inward tension long before any external sign was visible. Nothing so vulgar as banners unfurled or fleet musters announced to the wider Imperium. Rather a hardening of internal protocols. Sanctums opened that are not opened in lesser ages. Archivum wards checked and rechecked. Relics brought from one sealed shrine to another under triple oath and psychic shroud. Fleet assets quietly repositioned beneath the pretext of anti-demonic readiness. Brotherhoods warned in language so oblique that only their captains would understand what shadow had fallen across the chapter's soul. In such a scenario, the first act of triggering would not be a march upon Terra. It would be Titan holding its breath. One can easily imagine the preparatory steps, and they are dreadful precisely because they would look, from the outside, like nothing at all. The retrieval of scattered commanders from distant theaters, strike forces recalled from demon worlds under the guise of a broader strategic reprioritization. Brotherhood archives opened for comparisons of prophecy, relic precedent, and old sanction language. The gathering of certain artifacts whose names would never be spoken beyond the chamber walls. Teleportariums tested not for war in the ordinary sense, but for precision beyond ordinary war. Astropathic silence imposed where silence itself becomes a liturgy. Perhaps even contact with those few in the wider structures of the Imperium who could be trusted with fragments rather than truths. Not consensus, never that, but the narrowing of a circle until only those absolutely necessary remained within it. Such preparations would not mean the decree had been executed. They would mean something colder. That Titan had begun arranging itself around the possibility that execution might become unavoidable. In that arrangement, Drago's role would loom over everything, whether he stood physically upon Titan's stone or remained a presence half anchored in the warp. He is more than a commander in this matter. He is a sign. After the Great Rift, he gained the ability to return to the material realm for greater periods, and the prognosticars themselves linked his altered condition to wider forces, unbinding the old boundaries between real space and the immaterium. He already occupies that haunted threshold between worlds where the Grey Knight's deepest wars are fought. If the Terminus Decree ever moved from theoretical burden toward practical duty, Drago would matter not only as Supreme Grand Master and lawful opener of the box, but as the living embodiment of the age's instability. Whether present in body or guiding by apparition and counsel, he would be both symbolic and strategic. The lost blade returned from madness, the chapter lord who has seen too much of the warp and still walks. The one soul on Titan whose hand upon the seal would mean that the age had entered its most unforgiving claws. It is also possible, perhaps even likely, that the real trigger is simpler and more horrifying than people expect. Not the full carrying out of the decree, not the final clash of institutions, simply the opening of the box. The law says that what happens once the box is opened and the decree is spoken by the Supreme Grand Master is infinitely dangerous and will either save mankind from certain defeat or doom it to oblivion for all eternity. That wording leaves room for a grim distinction. The moment of triggering may be the moment the seal is broken and the command passes from hidden potential into conscious reality. In other words, the threshold may not be reached when the Grey Knights act upon terror, but when the Supreme Grand Master at last chooses to know in full what must be done. Everything after that might merely be consequence. In a universe such as this, knowledge itself is often the true weapon, and the revealing of a command can be more decisive than the swinging of any blade. That possibility opens another dark avenue. What if the Terminus Decree is not a single sentence, not one absolute order written with the cold brevity of a death warrant, but a structure of stages, a sequence of obligations, a chain of if-then clauses meant for an age in which the Emperor's condition, terror's peril, and the state of the warp might all shift from hour to hour? The old law does not tell us this directly, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but the scope of the decree's framing invites the thought. A command hidden beside Malcador's tomb and reserved for humanity's darkest hour may well contain more than one imperative. It may define thresholds. It may distinguish between warning, readiness, intervention, and the final unthinkable act. Such a structure would suit the Grey Knights perfectly, because they are not creatures of hysterical improvisation. They are instruments of layered necessity. An order of this magnitude would almost have to account for gradations of collapse, for the difference between a dying Imperium and a damned one. This is why the chapter must resist collapsing into a cheap vision of Grey Knights against Custodes too early. That image may one day become relevant, and if it does, it will be among the most tragic confrontations the setting could produce. But to begin, there is to misunderstand the spiritual texture of what is at stake. The true horror of the Terminus Decree lies not first in battle, but in inevitability, in the possibility that long before any blade is raised on Terra, the deed has already begun in subtler form on Titan, in the possibility that by the time the Custodes realize some hidden protocol is moving against the future they imagine for the Emperor, the protocol has already passed through stages of consultation, confirmation, readiness, and sanctified commitment. The Imperium always dreams of dramatic moments because dramatic moments are easy to see. It is the unseen moments that kill it. The order signed in darkness, the seal broken in silence. The chapter master who leaves a chamber knowing that the age before him has just become the age after. So when one asks what triggering the Terminus Decree might actually look like, the answer is not thunder first, it is dread first, a higher state of readiness on Titan. Grand Masters called into council, prognosticars reading warp pressure with increasing alarm, scattered commanders drawn inward, relics moved, oaths renewed, Drago, present or absent, becoming the axis around which all other judgments turn. Then perhaps the opening of the box itself, the golden seal broken at last by the one hand in all the chapter, permitted to profane that silence. And only after that, perhaps long after, whatever outward motions the Imperium might finally perceive, which leaves the bleakest implication of all. If the Terminus Decree is ever truly set in motion, then by the time anyone beyond Titan understands that it has happened, the decision may already have passed too far into sanctified necessity to be stopped. The real horror of the Terminus Decree is not that it is hidden. The Imperium is built from hidden things. Secret prisons, sealed vaults, forbidden archives, nameless wars fought in silence and then scoured from record. All of these are ordinary in the Emperor's realm. What makes the decree terrifying is that it appears to reveal, in one merciless stroke, what the Imperium truly is beneath all its banners, litanies, processions, and cathedral illusions. It is not a civilization marching toward redemption. It is a civilization organized around the preservation of a wound. The Golden Throne is not the temporary sickbed of a dying sovereign awaiting some eventual dawn. It is the central mechanism of a species that has learned to survive by locking catastrophe in place and kneeling before the lock. The old clues around the decree and the newer reporting on what it may actually command both point back to that same truth with suffocating force. That is why the Emperor's suffering can no longer be understood as mere sacrifice in the noble sense. Sacrifice implies an end state. It implies that pain is endured so that one day it may cease. But the darker reading of the Terminus Decree suggests something worse. It suggests that the Emperor's agony is not a bridge to victory at all. It is a maintained condition of cosmic containment. The Golden Throne continues to matter because it still suppresses older disaster, and the recent reporting on the decree frames the Grey Knight's hidden duty in exactly those terms. The Master of Mankind must not be allowed to leave the throne, whether by restoration, rebirth, or ascension, because the consequences of that release could be terminal for Terra and for the species bound to it. That transforms the image of the enthroned Emperor from tragic martyr to living seal. And once that possibility is admitted, the Grey Knights cease to look like the secret keepers of mankind's final miracle. They become something far sadder and more terrible. They become the tragic custodians of a truth no wider institution of the Imperium could survive hearing in full. For years the decree could be imagined as a path to liberation, a hidden answer, a final recourse by which the holiest warriors of Titan might release the Emperor from his long torment. But the newer implication twists that image into its opposite. The Grey Knights may instead be charged with ensuring that the torment continues. They may be the appointed wardens of endless necessity, the only brotherhood in the Imperium judged pure enough, secret enough, and ruthless enough to enforce a command that would look like sacrilege to almost every other soul alive. The old Great Rift reference matters here, because once Drago and the Grand Masters were recorded as considering the decree, it stopped being mere atmosphere and became a live burden within the chapter's highest councils. This is where Warhammer is at its strongest, and why the Terminus Decree feels so potent now. The setting does not reach its highest form when revelation becomes spectacle, when a hidden fact erupts merely to produce cheers, gasps, and simple reversals. It reaches its highest form when revelation causes spiritual collapse. When a mystery does not answer a question so much as expose that the question itself was naive. The Terminus Decree is devastating in exactly that way. It does not promise salvation. It promises a choice between different kinds of damnation. Leave the Emperor enthroned and preserve the wound forever. Permit him to rise and risk a catastrophe so vast that even the holiest miracle in human history might become the trigger for extinction. That is not a heroic fork in the road. That is Warhammer's preferred cruelty, the discovery that the last decision left to mankind may be only which ruin it is willing to endure. The Dark King implication sharpens that cruelty to a knife edge. The problem is not simply that the Emperor leaving the throne could unleash the old disaster buried beneath terror. The problem is also that his apotheosis is not guaranteed to be benevolent in any mortal sense. Lexicanum describes the Dark King as a theoretical fifth chaos god, long prophesied by humans and Eldari alike, and in the later siege of Terra Material, the Emperor is directly bound to that possibility. Once that possibility is taken seriously, the Grey Knight's hidden role becomes even darker and even more comprehensible. The decree may not exist because the Emperor is unloved. It may exist because his unconstrained divinity is too dangerous to be trusted by the species that worships him. In that reading, the cruelest order is also the necessary one, not anti-Emperor, anti-apocalypse. That moral architecture is perfect for the setting, because the Imperium has always mistaken postponement for triumph and containment for holiness. It feeds psychers into ancient machinery, buries truth beneath ritual, and calls survival victory, even when survival has become indistinguishable from a permanent state of managed ruin. The Terminus Decree feels like the purest expression of that civilization, because it distills the entire Imperial project into one possibility. The species may have to be saved, not by receiving the miracle it longs for, but by denying it, and the setting itself is now moving in ways that make that possibility feel less like static background myth, and more like a concept being actively circled. Official Warhammer community material describes the post-Rift era as a period in which events have been pushed forward into the era Indomitus, and later called the Arcs of Omen sequence, the most important narrative leap since the Gathering Storm. In a setting that is willing to move its central clock, revisiting a secret like the Terminus Decree carries a very different weight than it once did. That does not prove immediate execution. It does not prove that Titan has already broken the seal, or that the Grey Knights stand on the verge of descending upon Terra in the next beat of the metaplot. The evidence does not justify that sort of crude certainty. What it does justify is a more disciplined dread. The Great Rift pushed the decree from sealed relic towards serious consideration among the chapter's highest commanders. The newer Codex-era reporting narrowed its possible meaning toward the Emperor's continued enthronement. The Golden Throne's failing condition hangs over the entire setting as an ancient pressure that has only grown more severe with time. Taken together, these threads do not announce that the decree is being executed now. They strongly suggest that the setting is deliberately bringing the concept closer to the foreground. And that brings us to the final bitter shape of the thing. The Grey Knights may one day have to save mankind by denying it the very miracle for which it has prayed since the Emperor's body first withered upon the throne. They may have to preserve the species by preserving the wound. They may have to remain loyal not to the dream of the Imperium, but to the terrible mechanism by which that dream is prevented from becoming a species-ending delusion? That is the final grimdark question coiled at the heart of the Terminus Decree. What if the Emperor rising is not the Imperium's deliverance at all? What if it is its extinction event? And if that is even partly true, then the shocking evidence is not merely that the Grey Knights can trigger the Terminus Decree, it is that the galaxy is beginning to look more and more like the moment they were always waiting for.